I'm Venetia Rainey.
And I'm Arthur Scott Geddes.
And this is Battle Lines, Global Health Security. It's Wednesday, 12th of November, 2025.
For more than 2 years, a vicious civil war has been raging in Sudan. It's been defined by massacres, rapes, ethnic cleansing and starvation.
It's an issue we've covered repeatedly on Battle Lines, but most media weren't paying attention. That all changed recently when Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab published satellite pictures showing bodies and bloody sand. And there it was, incontrovertible evidence of a massacre unfolding.
This week, we'll be speaking to the Executive Director of Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab about the way satellites are being used to track war crimes from space.
We also hear from the Norwegian Refugee Council's Country Director for the latest updates on the situation in Fasher.
We ran into something we didn't expect, which was discoloration on the ground in areas where there were pickup trucks that had a .50 caliber machine gun on the back. We could see it from space.
We're joined now in the studio by Paul Newkey, who is the Global Health Security Editor at The Telegraph. Paul, could you just give us a recap of the last 2 years of this conflict?
So the conflict started 2 years ago, April 2023, and it's described by the UN and many others as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. It's affecting millions of people, partly in direct conflict, partly through displacement and starvation. The two sides are the Sudan's conventional army and the rapid support forces that has its roots in the Janjaweed militia of the early 2000s, which committed a genocide in Darfur then. So these two parties have been warring for the last 2 years. The RSF is once again dominating Darfur. And by most accounts, including the view of the US State Department, another genocide is occurring. And last week, we saw things pick up a pace when Fasher, the capital of North Darfur, was subject to a really intense attack.
Global Health has been covering this conflict throughout it. You've sent people to Sudan, and yet the stories have never quite picked up the same traction, I think it's fair to say, as Ukraine or even the Gaza war. But that's been very different with coverage over the last few weeks, and I think a lot of that is to do with the satellite pictures that have emerged from Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab. Tell us a bit about what that and why you think it struck a chord.
Yes, so it really has changed the media view of the war right across the world in the last week. I talked earlier to the people behind those images and asked them this question. And the answer I got was, if it bleeds, it leads, was his simple response. And I think that's right. You know, this eye in the sky brought home to people what a lot of others have been saying was about to happen or was happening in a way that they really couldn't ignore. And that's what's changed things in the last week.
All right, let's hear your interview with Nathaniel Raymond, the Executive Director of Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab.
Hi, Nathaniel. Thank you very much for joining us. We at The Telegraph and newspapers around the world have been trying to bring a focus on Sudan for several years now. You did it in a week. Could you tell us a little bit about how you brought that focus to Sudan last week and the technology behind it?
That story really begins in July 2023 with another massacre. We were at that point the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. We were working for the US State Department, and we were part of the effort to negotiate a ceasefire that was led by Saudi Arabia and the United States called the Jeddah process. And we had been supporting that effort with monitoring as part of the first attempted humanitarian ceasefire, which is relevant to where we are today with talks of another humanitarian ceasefire potentially being agreed, at least on RSF side. And a massacre broke out in the western city of El Geneina in Darfur. And it really was a preview of what we're seeing now in Fasher. It gave us the grim educational experience of dealing with RSF in a close quarter, urban environment, killing men and boys over multiple weeks. And we were able to receive, and this is some news for your listeners, ground photos from individuals who were engaged or witnessing body reclamation after that massacre. And so we got to have very specific photos of dead men and boys that we were able to cross corroborate with satellite imagery and do measurements to be able to get to a very standard unit of measurement for seeing a body from space. And that was 1.3 meters to 2 meters. And it was the men and boys who died in El Janeda, and having those ground photos against the satellite imagery that allowed us to do ground to space measurement calibration. And so that summer, we warned the UN Security Council in private session that one of 6 briefs we did to the UN Security Council that there would be a siege on El Fasher in the dry season of 23-24 that would result in a massacre. And unfortunately, we were correct 2.5 years out. And so we left U.S. government service and camped out on El Fasher for the past 18 months. And in that time, we observed the construction, and this is the most crucial thing, of what we call the berm, which is this 37-kilometer or more wall that has been built with bulldozers as high as 9 feet out of earth that we call the kill box that basically um, completed just a couple weeks before the fall of El Fasher. So when we got over El Fasher on Monday morning after it fell on Sunday, we knew what we were looking for in terms of specific telemetry on measuring bodies, and we knew what we were looking for in terms of how RSF would be, fancy term here, but their tactical disposition, meaning that they would be blocking the alleys and side streets with their vehicles. And we've seen this multiple times before. Would be blocking them to try to keep people in an area to kill them. And that's exactly what we saw in the area of Darajula. And then we ran into something we didn't expect, which was discoloration on the ground in areas where there were pickup trucks that had a 50 caliber machine gun on the back. We could see it from space. It's a classic, what we call technical gun mount. And we saw objects consistent with that 1.3 to 2 meter dimension. And they were doing what they often do when they're shot on the run or shot while moving, is they fall in the fetal position in the shape of a C, or they fall on their knees in a J shape. But what happened that became a critical tell is they bled out. And so we had this discoloration that was about a half a meter coming off of those individual bodies and the body piles. That discoloration, we then did a mathematical process. So this is very important because you're seeing a lot of rookie and amateur imagery analysis online that's tagging water points with cows, tagging wadis as blood pools. Those objects that are being tagged online and on Google Earth are 20 by 30 feet in many cases. Here we're talking about half a meter, right, of subtle red discoloration. With the mathematic process we ran, we got a color signal back, which read true red, okay, and which is expressed by a number on the spectrum. That was really important because we then go through what's called a red team process to try to create an alternate hypothesis for how these objects of this size could emit basically a red liquid near a giant heavy machine gun with an area where we know filled with civilians being trapped house to house. And we came to high confidence in intelligence speak. We came to high confidence through the NATO Admiralty standard of intelligence analysis. We came to high confidence that people were hit with a heavy machine gun at close range, bled out quickly, and likely in a group. And we stand by that assessment. Everything that's happened now as we approach almost 2 weeks, just under 2 weeks since that report, everything in terms of the pattern of life of the alleged perpetrators has provided further inculpatory evidence that what we saw then is what we were looking at.
The satellite imagery you're using, is that satellite imagery that is available to anyone, or is it special imagery available only to your team?
So what we're using is called commercial electro-optical satellite imagery. That's not the only thing we use. We use some other types of sensor data we can talk about, but this is very high resolution at 30 centimeter. And so what that means is that one pixel represents 30 centimeters of reflected light.
Right.
And that is as close as you can get in a unclassified capability. It's very expensive, and it is also very controlled in terms of who can access this data in some cases.
Once you've captured these images, how much analysis is necessary? So you talked previously about calibrating the size of objects so you know what you're looking at. Is all this done with the human eye and by an individual, or are you using AI and algorithms to run through it and find what you need to find?
Since the fall of Fasher, we've produced 5 reports against 12 days, which is crazy. Now, so to answer your question, what's the analysis like? It's like an episode of Iron Chef. It's sort of the Iron Chef equivalent of intelligence analysis, where when we wake up in the morning, we don't know what the special ingredient is. So it's battle spiny lobster, and we suddenly have to create 4 courses out of, um, whatever is in the mystery box. And so what that means is that we are often there's sort of two baskets analytically. One is the stuff we have to do all the time, no matter what we have, and that's really even if we are doing an algorithmic process, what's called supervised feature classification, using computer vision to help us count or identify an anomaly quicker, we always have to manually concur it. And so there's this idea that people have with the AI revolution now that somehow there's an easy button you press. Um, in fact, AI creates more work. That's what no
Okay.
one says, which is that with AI, you still have to manually validate. And so it can help you get closer, but there's still this list of analytic checks we have to do at all times. And part of that is what the red teaming I mentioned before, which is hostile counter-analysis. So we sit one analyst when able outside of the analytic process that does not see the data. And then at the end, we have to make the case to that person. They have to attack the analysis like they are a perpetrator themselves to counter it with alternate hypothesis. We do that no matter what. But then the other basket is really like golfing, where depending on the hole we're trying to hit, we'll pull out a bunch of different clubs and we won't use the same clubs all the time. So sometimes it's a 9-wood plus your putter. And that means across the full chain of collection to analysis to publication, we're making really fast, high-paced contextual analysis decisions on what tools we're going to use to collect on a target, what tools we're going to use to analyze, and that can include algorithms, and then also how we present the data. The presentation of the data in bad analysis is thought of as an afterthought, but for us, we have a very routinized process on how we create the images for public display. And there's 2 parts to it. One is ethical, which is, are we giving the perp decision support information they otherwise wouldn't have to kill more effectively, to conceal more effectively? Are we revealing civilian positions that they otherwise wouldn't know? The second part is, are we doing, to use the language of football, uh, are we doing an own goal? Some of the worst mistakes I've ever seen in imagery analysis, the analysis was not wrong, but it was presented visually in a confusing way that either obscured the finding, conflated the finding with something else, or didn't really communicate what the actual thing was. And so that clarity is essential in a very important way, because in the future we may have to testify. in the International Criminal Court. We may have to testify in domestic jurisdiction. And so we're crime scene techs, but from space. And you have to be ready in how you present that imagery publicly to go up against a defense attorney who is saying to you, okay, well, then why did you label it like that? Why did you put it at that resolution? You have to explain every single step that you made sleep deprived at 3 a.m. in the morning after doing it for 12 days in a row. You have to then, 10 years from now in a court, defend every single decision you make without messing up because you could cause a perp to walk. And so, that's a level of stress that is unlike anything you can think of because we cannot make a mistake.
No, it's an incredible responsibility. And tell me, how big is the team that you run there?
For security reasons, we don't give out the actual number. We have foreign intelligence services and non-state actors that want to understand how we connect to the internet, how many of us are connecting to the internet. And because we're not physically in the same place, where we take extreme precaution, we don't see each other's faces. And often we're not using our actual names, and we take immense precaution to hide our number and location. And some of the locations would surprise you. We have sort of 4 cells in the unit. One is imagery analysis, basically capability to analyze imagery. Second is OSINT, open source, and a lot of that is anthropological, cultural, and linguistic. So it means we have to understand, you can have robots in space, but you still have to understand colloquial Sudanese Arabic. You have to know the map locations. You have to know seasonal behaviors of these populations. And so that's existing on the OSINT side. The third cell is really on geostatistics. And so we have a lot of people who think about statistical analysis of data extracted from imagery at scale. So you're going to see over the next few weeks from us some products that are very different from what you're seeing, these close tactical products that are looking at trends of violence extracted from imagery over time that are statistically analyzed basically by epidemiologists and mathematicians to create evidence of intentionality of certain types of attacks. And then we also have basically the production and leadership team. How do you create a report every 48 hours? Well, you have to have people doing layout, comms, etc.
And your raison d'etre, if that's the right phrase, is to provide an eye for humanitarian disaster, right? Or humanitarian issue.
I think of myself more at this point, and I think many people on the team do, as a cop, in the sense that we in these types of scenarios, yes, we are providing very specific decision support information for humanitarians about humanitarian need, and that is to save, protect, and provide assistance to the living is job one. But the second part that often can sometimes run at cross purposes is we're also collecting evidence of crimes. And so your ambulance driver, your paramedic, and your police officer are both emergency services, but they often have very different jobs when they roll up at the accident scene. And so we're doing both at once. And that really requires a lot of intentional planning and intentional doctrine development. And so on an hourly basis, we have to say, okay, what's our main objective here? Are we trying to put Abu Lulu in jail? Or are we trying to make sure the UN can get the information they need to deliver aid at Tawila? And sometimes the answer is both. Sometimes both are important and urgent. They each require different types of analysis, different types of tempo. And the way you get it ethically wrong is by not identifying that often you're using the same data to do 2 wildly different things, both of which matter, but on different timescales.
there are a lot of conflicts, a lot of disasters, a lot of humanitarian emergencies happening around the world. How do you zoom in? How do you choose where to focus your time and resource?
For me, um, that's the hardest thing. It is just, I'll give you an example. There's been violence in Tanzania,
Yeah.
violence in a couple other countries in the past few days, and I'm getting calls from people saying, "Hey, can you do our crisis?" And so the most painful thing for me is when we have to make triage decisions. Right now, Al Fasher is, as we say, in U.S. firefighting, it's a 5 alarm fire. It's all bells, all trucks, and but meanwhile, you have issues like the election violence in Tanzania, where we could make a difference. And so it becomes this balance of consequences assessment that's now happening in an environment where since January in our field, 70 cents on every dollar has gone bye-bye with the Trump cuts. We had our Ukraine mission for U.S. State Department that was still ongoing cut, and then we were reinstated, and then we were cut again all in the past 6 to 8 months. And Ukraine team is now on a death clock for Christmas, and we're running out of money on that side. Meanwhile, we got 6 months of run on Sudan, and so if I pull the team off suddenly on tracking stolen Ukrainian kids on one side, a massacre in real time of potentially upwards of 200,000 people trapped in a kill box, and say we're going to go take a flyer on election violence X, which we have no money, we have no mandate, and we have no time, that can be a catastrophic success, even if we get it right. And so the point is no one team can or should do this all. Justice is a team sport, and we're seeing the ecosystem of organizations that do this work, from Bellingcat to C4IR to a lot of other great colleagues. We're all struggling right now with demand through the roof, capacity through the floor, and money dissolving into the air. And so it really comes incumbent on governments and on the public. If you want to see this type of work continue, you do need to pay for it. And if you want to see it expand to other areas, it can't just happen with a click of the remote control. It takes time to build these missions, and it takes personnel that are trained to do them. And you can't do that without money.
On Sudan specifically, there's all sorts of phrases that have been used to describe the conflict there in the last few years. The UN, I think, describes it as the world's worst humanitarian disaster, not just because of the killings, but the number of people displaced, the number of people facing malnutrition and starvation. How would you characterize the conflict from what you're seeing? Do you think a genocide is going on in Darfur?
Yes. And we were involved when we were within State Department service with the United States government on supporting information collection that contributed to the genocide determination by Secretary Blinken in his last week in office. Often we refer to Sudan as a forgotten emergency, and I hate that word, because um, the accurate word is an ignored, a willfully ignored emergency. Because the West, the United Kingdom, and the United States prioritize the diplomatic, security, and economic relationship with the United Arab Emirates over the lives of these people. Pure and simple. This was the most accurately warned mass atrocity event in human history, and governments made a decision to not do more because it would mean confronting Mohammed bin Zayed.
And that, I'm afraid, is a pattern with most genocides and most massacres in retrospect, isn't it? It turns out that countries, that people turned a blind eye. One question I've got for you it is around that, and it's the question I started with, really, is we as a newspaper have been trying hard to shine a spotlight on Sudan. You know, we've had people there. We've reported on it reasonably consistently for 2 years. but have failed to sort of spark a fire amongst our readers or more broadly. What is it, do you think, that happened last week with your imagery that suddenly caused the world's media to wake up and plaster it at the top of their bulletins on their front pages? Is there something specific about the media you use, or is it something specific about the information you uncovered?
I think it goes back to the oldest adage in the newspaper business: if it bleeds, it leads. And in this case, it literally bled. And I early in my career, I worked a lot on landmines, and we had this moment where the biggest moment for the international movement to ban landmines was the outpouring of individual donations from average people after an elephant stepped on a landmine and had to get a prosthetic leg in Thailand.
I remember.
That raised more money than the fact that we had hundreds of kids losing limbs every day in their lives. And you never know what it's going to be, what's going to cause that sort of catalytic moment of, oh my God, this is happening.
Over the months ahead, you'll obviously continue to be tracking what these military forces are doing. Will you also be looking at some of the other things that are killing people in the area, most notably the forced displacement of people, the hunger, crop failures, etc.?
We've already been doing that, and we're going to continue to do that. So last summer, the Famine Review Committee declared integrated phase classification level 5, the highest level of famine, for Fasher and elements of the surrounding area. They just updated it and added the city of Kadugli, and restated the IPC5 alert on Fasher. That was the first time that, to my knowledge, that remote sensing data was used as the primary source for the Famine Review Committee of the UN's determination. The fact of the matter is, you can't do MUAC, put a plastic strip around a child's arm to detect wasting, when you can't put people on the ground. And so we're doing that part on food security analysis by using fancy word NDVI, Normal Differentiated Vegetative Index analysis, through NASA satellites called Landsat, to detect crop growth.
You're looking at the amount of vegetation on the ground.
Yes, and we're also looking at patterns of arson against communities and vegetation to look at interplay between them. We also do a lot related to flooding. And so we just came out of the wet season. We're in the dry now. And every wet season, in particular, there's a high risk of cholera in Sudan. It can kill more people than bombs and bullets, and it moves extremely quick. And so a lot of what we can do is support responders on the ground by detecting standing water, detecting conditions and indicators that suggest water and sanitation situations that will cause cholera risk.
Where do you see this open source, eye in the sky type data taking us? It strikes me that in one sense, you know, it summons up sort of rather Orwellian visions, you know, that we're always under surveillance. No one can do anything without the eye in the sky spotting them. But on the other hand, you know, here you are revealing great injustices, and hopefully injustices which will be dealt with. So tell me where you see yourselves in future, and the role for this sort of intelligence.
Technology can do a lot of things. Technology can activate political will, but it cannot itself generate it. And I think, for me, we are further ahead technologically now than where I thought we would be 15 years ago, when we started using satellites to do this work and other forms of information communication technologies. We've technologically moved quicker. We're now at a point of daily refresh where we can collect imagery of the whole world if we wanted to every day. And that, so 5 years from now, we're going to have 3 to 5 times daily refresh rates at faster and faster revisit and closer resolution with more and more digital data to cross corroborate with more algorithmic support, faster storage, faster render, da 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 da. So all that's going to continue to happen. We are continuing to break all the expectations on speed of collect and speed of analysis with the systems that are now available. So the technology itself on a core level and the modality of it has not changed, but the processing capability behind it and the number of sensors has changed, and that's what's revolutionary in
Right.
many ways. It's not that AI is brilliant, it's that we collect more and we can pull more. Okay. And that puts us in a very different position than we were 15 years ago. Now we deal with data deluge, where before we dealt with data desert. But the underlying thing, which is true in both cases, is data equity. And it goes back to a question you asked, how do you decide where you deploy? And I get, we've done some work on Gaza, but I get messages all the time, why haven't you done more on Gaza? And I was like, well, no one paid for it, and all the work we did was volunteer. And it comes back to this line, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet.
Right. Okay.
So that's what I want to end on. The future's here. It's just not evenly distributed.
And the political will to see it properly deployed and used.
Well, then I end with the quote I use all the time. Frederick Douglass, talking of the abolition of slavery in America, said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And so it's incumbent on all of us in situations like Sudan, situations like Gaza, and situations you probably face in your home communities near and far. Will you make the demand? Because if you don't, power will concede nothing.
That was Nathaniel Raymond, Executive Director of Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, interviewed by Paul Nuki. Paul, thank you very much for coming on Battleline's Global Health Security.
Thank you.
Now, to get the latest on the situation on the ground in Fasher, we're joined by Shashwat Saraf. He's the Country Director for Norwegian Refugee Council in Sudan. Shashwat, welcome to Battleline's Global Health Security. You're currently in Tawila, which has become a humanitarian epicenter, absorbing people displaced from fighting in Fasher, Zamzam, other parts of Darfur. How many people are arriving every day at the moment, and what's your estimate for the total who are sheltering there right now?
The numbers that we are seeing arriving every day, it actually varies from 200 to 1,500 people. It's not a lot of people arriving in as we had expected. Numbers that we had for people in Fasher was about 250,000 people who were in Fasher, and we were actually hoping that a lot of people would move to places like Tawila, which are safer locations. Because in the past, when people moved from Zamzam camp just outside of Fasher, we saw an influx of close to 500,000 people coming into Tawila. So today, if we look at Tawila, we are talking about close to 700,000 internally displaced people who are in Tawila alone. It's a small, very small town, which basically today looks like one big open air camp with thatches and tarpaulin everywhere. But yes, since the last 1 week, we've seen a total of about 8,000 people who've come into Tawila from Fasher.
And you mentioned those numbers are lower than you expected. Why do you think that is?
So there are a few reasons that we think that the numbers are far lower than the numbers we should have seen arriving in Tawila. One is that we still feel that a lot of people are in Fasher and have not been able to leave Fasher or move out of Fasher. Second is that we also believe, and we know from testimonies of people who've arrived in Tawila, is that there are thousands of people who are still stuck and trapped in multiple different locations outside of Fasher. So they did make it out of Fasher, but then they have not been able to move outside of the different locations where they are. And there are a few reasons for that to happen. The first one being the fear of moving on the road, and the fear of being killed or actually being detained and kidnapped. So there is a very strong sense of fear. Even the people who arrived in Tavila have expressed how difficult it has been for them to move. They've actually used their elbows to crawl through the nights and days in sand in the desert, basically not to be spotted and not to be killed or shot. The second reason is that people have to pay to move, and people don't have resources in whatever location they have to be able to pay to move to safer locations like Tavila. So that's also the reason why people are not able to move. The third reason, from our understanding, is that Fasher was under siege for 18 months. We already knew about high malnutrition rates. We knew about the food insecurity and famine conditions in Fasher. There are a lot of people who are not in a condition to move, who are not in a condition to make this long, arduous, difficult journey on foot from wherever they are all the way to Tavila or other safer locations. So yes, there are various reasons why we are not seeing so many people, why people are still in different locations where they are today.
And what sort of stories are you hearing from people when they arrive? Are there stories and experiences that you hear repeated often?
The testimonies that we are hearing from people who are arriving is that they basically flee. They flee when bullets were flying all around, and when they realized that there were no more bullets around, and they looked around, they didn't know where their husband was, or where their wife was, or where their children was. And I think this has been a very consistent testimony. This has been a very consistent story from every single person who I have spoken with. The other stories that we are hearing are about being detained. So there are a lot of men who have talked about the fact that they were detained when they were on the road. They were captured, they were tied, they were beaten, and they were asked for money. And there are still many people who are in that state. There were some who were able to either pay or were able to escape, but they keep talking about how there are still many people who are in that condition. Many people who, when they arrive in Tavila, are dehydrated, are disoriented, sometimes not even able to remember their names. They've been walking for days, they don't know where they've been, and they have to be immediately referred for medical care. And this is the condition of a large number of people who are arriving in Tavila.
Just how dire is the hunger situation in El Fasher now?
Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in terms of market conditions, in terms of availability, and in terms of people's purchasing power to be able to afford what's available. So the food insecurity is rampant. It's there in Fasher, but there are also many other locations like Kadugli, Dilinj, which are also towns which are under siege, where also the IPC has once again said that there are famine conditions in those areas. So we do have multiple locations which are in famine, or which actually have very close to famine-like conditions, and people are in extreme levels of food insecurity.
What other challenges have you faced in times of trying to perhaps distribute aid on the ground, resistance from local actors? Could you talk a bit more about that?
Everyone from NRC to all the organizations have the same challenge of not having adequate resources to be able to scale up a response and to provide support at a scale at which it is required today. The challenges that we are constantly facing on the ground is people being upset, people being angry, and rightfully so. people not being able to understand as to why someone else is being prioritized over them. Today I was at a distribution site of NRC where we're doing cash assistance. We're providing cash so that people can choose what is a priority for them, and they can determine for themselves as to how they would want to support themselves and their households or their families. And there were about 1,000 people sitting there. And what we were able to provide today was for 150 households only. So we had to constantly go and talk to people. And it was very difficult for our teams to be able to explain, to be able to talk about, one, the resources and the resource gap, and how we are trying to prioritize and why we are doing it. But also, the other hand, we also face the challenge of not having the cash available in the market. As in, over the last 2.5 years, there have been issues of physical cash availability in the market, given that a new currency was put in place in Port Sudan, whereas in Darfur, we continue to use the old currency, which is no longer printed. So the availability of cash itself for us to be able to distribute to the households is complex and challenging. So there are multiple challenges at different levels, from being able to meet the expectations of the people, to be able to maneuver the lack of banking and financial services in Darfur, constantly puts us in a dilemma of how do we do it, but it also in some ways puts our teams constantly at risk, and safety for themselves, being in a place where thousands of people expect something which we are not able to provide for.
Which are the experiences or the testimonies that you've heard that have really stuck with you, of all the people you've met?
I still remember walking into one of our learning tents where we do early education programming, and there were hundreds of children. I would say there were about 250 children in that tent. And then a very old man walks into the tent with a very small child, probably 4 or 5 years old, walks in and asks the children if they know her, if anybody knows her parents, if anybody. So for me, a child walking in with a stranger, and the stranger trying to find out if anybody or any of the children would know who the parents of the child, or if from Fasher or from the camp itself, is something which is very heartbreaking. And this is not just one story.
That was Shashwat Saraf, Country Director for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Now, before we go, we wanted to say a big thank you to David Gomez, a trauma surgeon in Canada who wrote in to say how much he's been enjoying this new strand of battle lines. He shared some fascinating research about what was learned from exercise Trillium Cura, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which wargamed last year how Ontario's health system would hold up in a prolonged conventional war like Ukraine's. It was part of Canada's advanced planning as a NATO member for a large-scale combat operation and is now in the process of being repeated nationally. We love to hear about this kind of stuff, and we'd love to hear from you if you're enjoying the show or have ideas of what we should cover. You can write to us at battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or leave a comment underneath this episode on YouTube and Spotify.
That's all we have time for this week on Battle Lines Global Health Security. Goodbye.
Goodbye.